Number 1. The Schöneck-Kilianstädten Massacre. Picture a road crew in the German state of Hesse in the year 2006 cutting a trench through pale brown soil. The shovels stop against something white, not a stone, a jaw, then a second and a third until the trench opens into a grave holding at least 26 people, all thrown into the ground at the same moment. This is Schöneck-Kilianstädten, and it is roughly 7,000 years old. The victims belong to the first farming culture of Central Europe, a people archaeologists call the linear pottery culture, who spread across the continent between about 5,600 and 4,900 years before the Common Era. For a long time, these early farmers were imagined as gentle, peaceful, tied to their fields and their pots. The grave at Schöneck ended that picture. The lead researcher, Christian Meyer, published the findings in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in the summer of 2015, and the details are hard to forget. Around half of the dead had their lower leg bones deliberately shattered at or around the time of death, not broken in a fall, snapped on purpose. And here, the interpretation split three ways. Some argue it was torture inflicted before death. Some argue it was mutilation of the corpses, a way to stop the dead from walking back. And some argue it was done to permanently cripple any survivor who might crawl away. No one can prove which. What is certain is the rest of the wound pattern. Skulls were caved in by blunt blows matching the heavy stone adzes these farmers used to fell trees and till earth. Small triangular flint arrowheads had struck others, and the dead were overwhelmingly adult men and children. The young women were missing. That absence is itself a clue, because across these massacre sites the same grim arithmetic repeats. The men and children are killed on the spot. The women of childbearing age are taken. Meyer called it a template, a repeating recipe of violence at the close of this farming era. The bodies at Schöneck were not laid to rest, they were tipped in face down and tangled, without a single grave gift or a moment of ceremony. The youngest was an infant of about 6 months, an entire small settlement erased between one dawn and the next. So if this was a template, a pattern repeated by rote, where else did it happen, and could it possibly get stranger than a pit of broken legs? It could. Because the next site is a pit that holds no bodies at all. Only heads. Number 2. The Ofnet cave skull nests. In a cave in Bavaria called the Grosse Ofnet Höhle, an excavator named Robert Rudolf Schmidt dug into the floor in the year 1908 and found something that still unsettles archaeologists. 2 shallow pits. And inside them, packed tight and touching, 34 human skulls, arranged like eggs in a basket. Many reportedly turned to face the same direction. There were no bodies, only heads. The deposit dates to the Mesolithic, roughly 8,000 years ago, when the last hunter-gatherers of Europe were living in a warming, forested world. The skulls had been coated so thickly in red ochre, a rusty iron pigment used in death rituals across the whole of prehistory, that the color soaked into the surrounding earth. With the skulls lay ornaments, perforated red deer teeth and pierced shells, and these clustered mostly with the women and children. The adult skulls carried the marks of violence, caved in by axe or club. And on the neck vertebrae, still attached to some of them, were cut marks, the unmistakable sign that these heads had been deliberately severed. Here is where the horror becomes an argument. The demographic is the exact inverse of a battlefield, mostly women and children, few adult men. So one reading is a massacre, the heads taken as trophies and buried together. But another reading is almost the opposite, a reverent head cult, skulls of the community collected over years, decorated and laid to rest with care. And the debate has only deepened, because newer dating work suggests the skulls may not all belong to the same moment, which would undermine the single massacre idea entirely. The setting adds to the strangeness. The Ofnet cave sits inside the Nördlinger Ries, a vast basin blasted out by a meteorite impact some 15 million years ago. So these decapitated heads were nested inside an ancient scar in the earth. Whatever happened here, Ofnet gives us some of the oldest evidence in Europe of systematic decapitation and the deliberate curating of skulls. It is cited again and again in the debate over whether the Mesolithic grew more violent as populations swelled and pressed against one another. The truth is, with the skulls alone, we cannot fully settle whether we are looking at murder or mourning. The same bones read as atrocity or as reverence, depending on who holds them. which raises an obvious question. If injured bones cannot always tell us intent, is there anything that can? There is. And it comes from inside the bones themselves, from the genetic code locked in the teeth. Our next site is where that code rewrote the story completely. Number 3, the Potočani mass grave. In 2007, a family in the Croatian village of Potočani began digging the foundation for a garage. Just under the surface, they struck a pit barely 2 meters across and 1 meter deep. And crammed into that small space were the remains of at least 41 people. The grave dates to about 4,200 years before the Common Era in the Copper Age. And for years, it looked like a straightforward tragedy. Then, in 2021, a team led by Mario Novak in Zagreb published a genetic study in the journal PLOS ONE that turned the intuition inside out. They recovered ancient DNA from 38 of the 41 individuals, an extraordinary sample from a single grave. The dead were of every age and both sexes, 21 males and 20 females, from small children to the elderly. 21 of them had blunt force wounds to the back and sides of the skull, struck from behind or above, the signature not of a fair fight but of an execution. And now, the twist. When you find a mass grave, the natural assumption is that you are looking at one extended family wiped out together. The DNA proved the opposite. The victims were, for the most part, not related to one another at all. Only a handful of biological relatives among 41 people. Their genetic diversity was high, with no sign of the inbreeding you would expect from a small, isolated band. This was a real mixed community, and it was slaughtered indiscriminately. The killers were not targeting a bloodline. They were killing everyone. The researchers set this against the backdrop of the Copper Age, a time of rising population, movement, and competition for land and resources across the Balkans and Central Europe. There were no defensive wounds on the forearms, the marks people get when they raise their hands against a blow, which suggests the victims were restrained or cut down too fast to resist. And like Schöneck, like the sites still to come, the bodies were simply dumped, no grave goods, no orientation, no ceremony. The completeness of the group, every age and both sexes, rules out a battle. This was the deliberate elimination of a community, non-combatants included, one of the oldest clear cases of indiscriminate mass murder in Europe. Isotopes in their teeth showed they were locals, not strangers passing through. So the ground of Europe keeps producing these hidden pits, each one revealed by accident. But not every society hid its violence. Some carved it into stone and put it on public display thousands of miles away on the coast of Peru. Number 4. The Sechín Massacre Temple. On the arid coast of north-central Peru in the Casma Valley stands a temple older than almost anything else built in the Americas. Sechín dates to around 1,600 years before the Common Era, more than 3,000 years before the Inca ever rose. It was reported to the scientific world by the pioneering Peruvian archaeologist Julio Tello in 1937. And what makes it unforgettable is its outer wall, faced with somewhere between 300 and 400 carved granite slabs. On those slabs, armed figures stride, carrying staffs and weapons. And between them, everywhere between them, are the dismembered. Severed heads with their eyes closed in death. Arms and legs cut loose from their owners. Spinal columns laid bare. Trailing lines that most interpreters read as spilling entrails and blood. Some figures are cut clean in half at the waist. Others are stacked like cordwood. This is a monument whose entire decorative program is slaughter. What does it mean? Here the theories diverge with real intensity. One reading holds that the standing armed figures are the victors and the dismembered are the defeated, that this is a war memorial, a public boast in stone, and perhaps a warning to any enemy who approached. Another reading argues the imagery is not battlefield violence at all, but ritual, human sacrifice, and bloodletting, central to the religion of these people. Because there is no writing, no inscription to explain the scene, the argument is carried entirely by the images themselves. Sechín belongs to what archaeologists call the Andean formative period, the deep foundation of later Andean civilization. The carving style is flat and incised, figures rendered in stark silhouette at close to human height, and beneath the stone facade lie even earlier structures of cone-shaped adobe showing the site was rebuilt across generations. Count the individual body parts across the whole wall and you reach into the hundreds. And this was not an isolated obsession. Nearby, the site of Sechín preserves monumental architecture as old as 3,500 years before the Common Era, among the oldest in all the Americas, which places Cerro Sechín inside a very deep local tradition. What is strange is how graphic it is. The art of this period usually leaned on abstraction, on stylized animals and geometric forms. Here, instead, is anatomical butchery, deliberately public, deliberately permanent. Whoever built this wanted the fate of the dismembered to be seen and remembered forever. Carving slaughter into rock is one kind of horror. Actually consuming the dead is another. And our next site is where scientists proved bone by bone that people were once processed exactly like game. Number 5, the Fontbrégoua cave cannibalism. Near the town of Salers in the south of France lies Fontbrégoua cave, excavated across the 1960s, 70s, and 80s by the archaeologist Jean Courtin. Among the ordinary refuse of a Neolithic settlement, roughly 6,000 years old, his team found something that would become a landmark in the study of cannibalism. In 1986, the researcher Paula Villa and her colleagues published their analysis in the journal American Antiquity, and its power lay in cold comparison. In the cave were the bones of at least 6 human beings, and in the same cave were the bones of animals, sheep, goat, wild boar, and deer. When Villa's team examined the 2 sets of remains side by side, they found the same cut marks in the same places. The same technique of slicing muscle from bone, of separating joint from joint, of smashing the long bones open to reach the marrow inside. The humans had been butchered exactly as the animals had been butchered, and the 2 were discarded in separate but comparable refuse pits, as if human and animal remains were simply 2 kinds of the same waste. The cut marks fell precisely where muscles and tendons attach, the marks of deliberate defleshing. Villa concluded this was dietary cannibalism, human beings processed and consumed as food. What made the study so important was the method. For the first time, forensic bone analysis could firmly separate true cannibalism from funerary practices like cleaning and reburying the dead. And Fontbrégoua passed that test decisively, because no funeral rite butchers. A body the way you butcher a boar. The remains represented not one desperate moment, but multiple episodes, meaning this was a repeated practice, not a single starvation crisis. And crucially, these were settled farmers with domestic animals and stored food, not foragers on the edge of death. The debate over motive continues even now. Was it survival in some lean season the evidence does not capture? Was it the eating of defeated enemies, a way of consuming a rival group? Or was it a ritual consumption of one's own dead, a form of reverence expressed through the body? Fontbrégoua could not close that question, but it proved the act itself beyond reasonable doubt, and in doing so, it launched the modern science of archaeological cannibalism, the same methods later turned on famous sites like Gough's cave. It also revealed how powerfully the taboo against cannibalism can blind us, how easily we look away from the physical evidence when it is right in front of us. If our own species did this, the obvious question is whether our closest human cousins did too. And in a cave in northern Spain, the answer was written in the bones of an entire family. Number 6. El Sidrón, Neanderthal, Cannibalism. In the hills of Asturias in northern Spain, a cave called El Sidrón hides one of the most informative Neanderthal sites ever found. Discovered in 1994 and excavated systematically from the year 2000 onward, it preserved the remains of at least 13 Neanderthals who lived roughly 49,000 years ago. Among them were 6 adults, an adolescent, 3 juveniles, and 3 infants. And their bones tell 2 stories at once. The first story is cannibalism. The remains carry cut marks, deliberate fractures, and percussion pits, the signs of defleshing and of long bones cracked open for marrow, even of the skull opened for the brain. The research team, led by Antonio Rosas, Carles Laluesa Fox, and Marco de la Resila, interpreted the group as a single family that died in one event, most likely a period of starvation, and was then processed for food by other Neanderthals. There is no sign of ritual here, no ochre, no arrangement. The processing appears purely nutritional, the desperate act of the hungry. But the second story is what makes El Sidrón extraordinary, because these same bones opened a window into Neanderthal life that no massacre site ever could. Ancient DNA revealed the group's structure. The adult males all shared the same maternal genetic lineage, while the adult females carried different lineages, evidence that the males stayed in their birth group while the females moved between groups, a social pattern called patrilocality. This was some of the first Neanderthal genetic data ever recovered, and it even carried a gene variant suggesting some Neanderthals had pale skin and red hair. Then came the hardened plaque on their teeth. Locked inside that dental calculus was a record of what they ate and how they cared for themselves. One individual suffering from a painful dental abscess had been consuming poplar, a plant that contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, along with traces of the penicillium mold, a natural source of antibiotic. Nearly 50,000 years ago, a sick Neanderthal appears to have been self-medicating with a painkiller and a natural antibiotic. The same teeth showed a diet including mushrooms, pine nuts, and moss, overturning the cartoon of the Neanderthal as a pure meat eater. So El Sidrón holds both faces of humanity in one chamber, a family consumed in a moment of starvation, and a people who understood medicine, who cared for their sick, who carried tools of non-local stone into the dark. It stands apart from the other known cases of Neanderthal cannibalism at Mulagorsi and Goyet Cave, an independent proof that our cousins too ate their dead when the world turned against them. Starvation drove that horror. But organized killing between groups is older still, older than farming, older than these caves. To find its oldest cemetery, we have to travel to the banks of the ancient Nile. Number 7. Jebel Sahaba. On the edge of the Nile, in what is now northern Sudan, in the land the ancients called Nubia, lies a cemetery known simply as Site 117, or Jebel Sahaba. It was excavated in the 1960s by the archaeologist Fred Wendorf, part of a frantic rescue effort to save antiquities before the waters of the Aswan High Dam drowned the region forever. And what Wendorf found is often called the oldest known cemetery bearing the marks of warfare on Earth. Jebel Sahaba is roughly 13,400 years old, deep in the last ice age, thousands of years before anyone farmed a single field. In a formal cemetery, he uncovered the remains of at least 61 people, and nearly 45% of them showed injuries linked to violence. Small chipped stone projectile points were found embedded in their bones and lodged inside their body cavities, the tips of arrows and spears that had killed them and stayed with them into the grave. The victims were men, women, and children alike, which tells us these were attacks on whole communities, not duels between warriors. They belonged to the Cladh culture, the hunter-gatherers of the late Ice Age Nile. And in 2021, a new analysis led by Isabelle Crèvecoeur and Daniel Antoine re-examined the bones under the microscope, with results that changed the meaning of the site. Wendorf had recorded serious injuries, but the new study found many more, including healed wounds, injuries these people had survived only to be hurt again. The mix of healed and unhealed trauma pointed not to one catastrophic battle, but to repeated violence spread across lifetimes, generations of raiding and skirmishing along the river. Why here? Why then? The end of the Ice Age was reshaping the Nile, and as the surrounding lands shifted, human groups were squeezed together along the water, competing for the same shrinking resources. Territory became worth killing for. The projectile points are classic Cladh work, small-backed blades and tiny geometric microliths, and the dead were buried carefully, in flexed positions, in a designated ground, which means these people practice formal mortuary ritual and lethal violence at the same time. Much of the collection now rests in the British Museum, which made the modern restudy possible. Jebel Sahaba sits at the very center of one of the biggest questions in archaeology. Did organized human warfare begin with farming, with property and borders, or is it far older, woven into us long before we settled down? The evidence in these Ice Age bones argues for the deeper, darker answer. But violence is only half of what these sites reveal. What people did to the dead afterward can be stranger than how they died. And on a Scottish island, the dead were rebuilt. Number 8. the Cladh Hallan composite mummies. On the windswept island of South Uist in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, archaeologists led by Mike Parker Pearson began excavating a Bronze Age settlement called Cladh Hallan in the late 1990s. Beneath the floors of the roundhouses where families had once lived, they found human bodies deliberately buried, dating to around 13 to 1500 years before the Common Era. And two of those bodies held a secret that rewrote what we thought prehistoric Britain was capable of. They had been mummified. Chemical and analysis of the bones showed they had been placed for about a year into an acidic peat bog, long enough for the bog to halt decay and preserve the soft tissue, and then pulled out again before the same acid could dissolve the bones. This was not accident. This was technology. A precise understanding of the chemistry of rot roughly 3,500 years ago. The bodies had then been kept above ground for centuries before they were finally buried, around 1120 years before the Common Era, hundreds of years after the people had actually died. But the strangest discovery came from the DNA and the anatomy. The male mummy was not one person. It was a composite, assembled from the body parts of at least 3 different individuals. A torso from one person, a skull from another, a jawbone from a third, people who had died at different times, fitted together into a single false body. And the female mummy was composite too, including a male skull placed on a female body. Radiocarbon dating of the separate parts proved it because the pieces differed in age by hundreds of years. The tight crouch burial position may have been the very thing that held these reassembled bodies together as they were arranged. Why would anyone build a person from the dead? The leading interpretation is that these composites merge the identities of different ancestors, perhaps to fuse 2 lineages, to legitimize a family's claim to land or kinship by literally uniting their forebears into one body. The ancestors were not buried and forgotten. They were preserved, displayed, and physically manipulated, kept as objects of ongoing power and identity, then finally laid beneath the floors of the living. The discovery shattered the assumption that deliberate mummification belonged only to Egypt or the Andes. It also raised an uneasy possibility. If 2 mummies here were secret composites, how many other single skeletons across prehistoric Britain are quietly assembled from more than one person? Later work by Parker Pearson and Tom Booth suggested mummification may in fact have been widespread across Bronze Age Britain. One household kept and rebuilt its dead. Elsewhere in Europe at the same time, the dead were piling up by the hundreds on a single riverbank, in a battle so large no one believed it could have happened. Number 9. The Tollense Valley Battlefield. In the northeast of Germany, a quiet river called the Tollense winds through a marshy valley. In 1996, an amateur archaeologist noticed a bone protruding from the bank, an upper arm bone, and jutting from it, a flint arrowhead. That single bone opened the oldest large-scale battlefield ever discovered in Europe. Systematic study began between 2007 and 2009, led by the archaeologist Thomas Terberger, and it dated the battle to around 1250 years before the Common Era in the Nordic Bronze Age. From only a small excavated fraction of the valley, researchers have recovered the remains of well over 140 people. Estimates based on the density of bones suggest the total number of fighters may have reached 2,000 or more, with hundreds killed. And these dead were overwhelmingly young men, the profile of an army, not a massacred village. Their bones carry the full vocabulary of Bronze Age combat, skulls fractured by clubs, flint and bronze arrowheads still lodged in the bone, slashing wounds from blades. The waterlogged, low-oxygen mud even preserved wooden weapons, clubs shaped almost like a baseball bat, carved from ash, and a curved club of blackthorn wood. The styles of the arrowheads hint that the combatants may have come from different regions, and isotope analysis of their teeth supports it, suggesting some fighters had traveled from hundreds of kilometers away. This was not a squabble between 2 neighboring hamlets. This was interregional war. And that scale is the real shock, because it implies a level of organization, of logistics, of command and coordination that Bronze Age Northern Europe was never thought to possess. Someone gathered these fighters, someone armed them with standardized kits. For the dead, carried bronze rings, tin objects, and small matching tool sets. Many of the fighters bore healed injuries from earlier fights, meaning they were experienced, seasoned in combat, not farmers grabbing tools in a panic. The likely prize was a crossing, a causeway or bridge over the river, a strategic choke point worth fighting and dying to control. Many of the bodies were left in the water or swept into it, which is precisely why they survived, sealed away from air and decay for more than 3,000 years. And only a small percentage of the presumed battlefield has been dug, so the count of the dead keeps climbing with each season. Tollense forced a hard rewrite of the Bronze Age, revealing the existence of trained, possibly semi-professional warrior groups long before any historian recorded a single battle. Tollense was warriors meeting warriors, but the last site on our list is the one that many people half remember, the one so infamous it earned a terrible nickname, and its victims were not soldiers at all. Number 10. The Talheim Death Pit. In 1983, in the town of Talheim in southwestern Germany, archaeologists uncovered a pit that would become one of the most cited discoveries in the study of ancient violence. Inside it lay 34 people, 16 of them children, 18 of them adults, and the site has been called, again and again, the first genocide. Like Schöneck, the victims of Talheim belonged to the linear pottery culture, the first farmers, and they died around 5,000 years before the Common Era, some 7,000 years ago. The manner of their death is written plainly in their skulls. They were killed by blows to the head, and most were struck from behind, meaning they were fleeing or kneeling or otherwise unable to face their attackers. The weapons were identified from the shape of the wounds, and this is the chilling detail. They were the odzes of these very farmers, the polished stone tools sometimes called shoe-last celts, that were used to work wood and till the earth. The tools of cultivation had become the tools of slaughter. The researchers Joachim Wahl and Hans-Georg König, publishing in 1987, matched specific odza blades to the distinctive shapes of the wounds, and found at least 2 different types of odza, which means more than one attacker, a coordinated group. The bodies were flung into the pit without goods, without order, without ceremony, dumped as if disposing of a problem. Later, isotope work by researchers, including Kurt Alt and colleagues, suggested that the attackers and the victims may have come from different communities, and that some of the victims were outsiders or migrants. And once again, the local young women were underrepresented among the dead, hinting they had been abducted rather than killed, the same signature that runs through Schöneck. The interpretation is stark. This was the annihilation of an entire small farming settlement in a single event, set against a backdrop of drought, land pressure, and the crisis that ended this farming era around 5,000 years before the Common Era. The completeness of the group, men, women, and so many children, rules out any notion of a battle between equals. The scarcity of defensive wounds confirms it was an execution. Talheim belongs to a cluster of these terminal massacres, alongside Schöneck-Kilianstädten, Aspern in Austria, and Halberstadt, spread across Central Europe like the fingerprints of a single, spreading catastrophe. It overturned the mid-20th century dream of the Neolithic as a peaceful farming idyll, and it returns us to the question we began with. If the same template of killing appears again and again across a whole continent, in the very cradle of farming, then how do we actually know any of this? How do bones, thousands of years old, confess to murder? The uncomfortable truth is that bones almost never announce their own story. A skeleton in the ground does not say whether it was murdered, buried with love, or scattered by a flood. Everything you have heard so far rests on a quiet revolution in forensic archaeology, the science of making the dead speak. It begins with the fracture itself. Bone broken around the time of death while it is still fresh and greasy breaks differently than bone broken long after, when it has dried and mineralized. The color of the fracture edge, its texture, the angle of the break, all let a specialist separate a killing blow from damage done by a bulldozer 7,000 years later. Then come the cut marks. Under a microscope, the fine V-shaped groove of a stone tool looks nothing like the ragged pit of a carnivore's tooth or the polish of trampling. That distinction is what let Paula Villa prove cannibalism at Fontbrégoua by comparing human bones directly to butchered animals. The shape of a blunt wound can even be matched to a specific tool, which is how Talheim's odzes were identified. Embedded projectiles, a flint point buried in an arm bone, are the single clearest sign of interpersonal violence. The smoking gun of sites like Jebel Sahaba and Tollense. Healed injuries separate a lifetime of raiding from one final massacre. And then there is the newest and most powerful tool of all, ancient DNA. It was DNA that proved the Potočani victims were strangers, not one family. It was DNA that mapped the Neanderthal family structure at El Sidrón. It was DNA and radiocarbon dating together that exposed the Cladh Hallan mummies as composites, bodies stitched from different centuries. Strontium and oxygen isotopes locked into tooth enamel in childhood reveal whether a person grew up local or arrived from far away. Demographic profiling, the simple accounting of age and sex, separates a battle of young men from the massacre of a whole community. And all of it must pass through taphonomy, the study of everything that happens to a body between death and discovery, the water, the animals, the collapsing cave roofs. The danger runs both ways. Read too much violence into ambiguous bones, and you invent atrocities that never happened. Read too little, and you miss them, exactly as the original Jebel Sahaba study missed injuries that microscopy later found. Each generation of tools reopens century-old collections and asks new questions, because in the end, intent is everything. It is the difference between a graveyard and a crime scene. And it explains why so many of these crime scenes cluster in the same slice of time. For most of the 20th century, the story of farming was a story of peace. Humanity settled down, grew surplus food, built villages, and traded the chaos of the hunt for the calm of the field. But the pits tell a different story, and it forces a hard question. Why does organized massacre appear so densely right at the dawn of agriculture? The answer may lie in what farming actually created. A field is not just food, it is property. It cannot be carried away when danger comes. Stored grain is wealth that can be stolen, a granary is a target, and a plot of good soil is worth defending and worth seizing. For the first time, people had fixed valuable things that could not simply be abandoned. At the same time, farming let populations grow, and growing populations pressed closer together, competing for the best land and water. Notice how many of the worst sites, Talheim, Schöneck, Aspern in Austria, Halberstadt, all cluster near the same moment, around 5,000 years before the Common Era, at the very end of Central Europe's first farming culture. That timing is not a coincidence. It coincides with evidence of drought and environmental stress, the kind of pressure that turns neighbors into rivals. And these were small-scale societies with no courts, no police, no higher authority to settle a dispute. When a feud ignited, there was nothing to stop it escalating all the way to annihilation. The template repeats because the logic repeats. Kill the men and children, take the women, erase the settlement, take the land. 1,000 years later, the Potočani grave shows the same indiscriminate killing had not gone away. And Jebel Sahaba, thousands of years earlier, shows that even before farming, environmental stress along the Ice Age Nile could drive groups to slaughter one another. So farming did not invent human violence. What it did was give violence more to fight over, and more that could not be carried away from the fight. As societies grew more complex, the violence scaled with them. From a pit of 34 bodies to the 2,000 fighters of Tollense, and in Peru, into monuments that turned butchery into political theater. The picture that emerges is neither the noble savage nor the peaceful farmer. It is something more human and more troubling. Violence that pulsed with scarcity and fear, flaring when the world grew hard. And when the killing was done, these people turned to their dead. And what they did next is its own strange chapter. Across every site in this story runs a second, quieter theme. Prehistoric people almost never simply buried their dead and walked away. The dead had work to do among the living. At Ofnet, heads were severed, painted with ochre, and nested together in the earth. At Cladh, bodies were soaked in bog, dried, kept for centuries, and rebuilt from many people into one. This is deliberate technology applied to the corpse, and it reveals a relationship with the dead that we have largely lost. Consider red ochre, that rusty pigment. It appears on the dead across continents and across tens of thousands of years, a near-universal color of death, staining the Ofnet skulls so deeply it dyed the soil. Consider decapitation, which appears in both violent and reverent contexts, sometimes a trophy torn from an enemy, sometimes a relic kept from a beloved ancestor. The same act, opposite meanings. This is the knife edge that makes prehistoric mortuary practice so hard to read. Cannibalism itself splits into two mirror images. Endocannibalism, the eating of one's own dead, can be an act of love, a way of keeping the departed inside the living. Exocannibalism, the eating of enemies, is an act of domination and contempt. The bones can look similar, only the context tells them apart. At Cerro Sechín, the dismembered were carved into stone and displayed forever, violence transformed into public memory. At Cladh, Hallan, ancestors were laid beneath the floors of the houses so that families literally lived on top of their dead. Even in a massacre grave like Ofnet, ornaments of deer teeth signal that status and identity followed people into death. And everywhere there is secondary burial, the practice of moving, cleaning, and rearranging bones long after the flesh is gone. Why go to such trouble? Because the dead were the anchor of identity, of inheritance, of belonging. To hold your ancestor's skull or to build a body that fused two lineages was to hold a claim to land, to legitimacy, to a place in the order of things. The ancestors legitimized the living. This is why the same bones can read as atrocity or as reverence, and why the honest answer so often is that we cannot be certain which. The line between honoring the dead and controlling them was never as sharp as we would like. And that uncertainty, that discomfort, is a large part of why these sites almost never make it into the history books at all. There's a reason you can pass through years of schooling and never hear the names Talheim or Potočani or Jebel Sahaba. History, as it is usually told, begins with writing. Everything before the first inscription is filed under prehistory, a vast dim prologue that most textbooks hurry past on their way to Egypt and Sumer. And without names, without dates, without a single written word from the people themselves, these mass killings become statistics rather than stories. It is hard to mourn a number. There's also comfort at stake. The myth of a peaceful past is a pleasant one, and disturbing evidence resists it. Museums, understandably, hesitate to display the cannibalized, the mutilated, the pit of murdered children. National stories prefer to open with the origins of art and agriculture rather than the origins of massacre. The victims themselves left no testimony but their injured bones, and bones are easy to keep in a drawer and out of the gallery. And yet, the evidence is not rare. It is abundant once you are willing to look. What should unsettle us most is how these sites were found. Not by careful search, but by accident. A road crew at Schöneck, a garage foundation at Potočani, a riverbank at Tollense, a rescue dig ahead of a rising dam at Jebel Sahaba. Each was stumbled upon. Which forces the question of how much more lies unexcavated beneath our modern towns, our fields, our highways, waiting. But there is a counterweight, and it matters. The same science that reveals the massacre pit also reveals the healed bone, the tended wound, the sick Neanderthal at El Sidrón, dosed with a natural painkiller and antibiotic by someone who cared whether he lived. The full human story holds both at once, the capacity for slaughter and the capacity for tenderness, often in the very same community. To leave out the atrocities is to tell only half of who we were. The dead deserve accuracy more than they deserve comfort. And confronting the darkness is not morbid. It is honest. These 10 sites are a correction, a refusal to let the past be sanitized into something easier than the truth. Return for a moment to that single shattered shin bone in a trench in Hesse. 7,000 years of silence compressed into the space of a museum drawer. It is easy across such a gulf of time to imagine the people in these graves as something other than us, as primitives, as monsters, as a species we have safely outgrown. But they were not monsters. They were farmers and hunters, parents and children. The same hands that planted grain caved in skulls. The same species that carefully medicated a dying relative also cracked open the bones of its own dead for marrow. Violence and tenderness were not separate worlds. They sat side by side, in the same caves, in the same households, in the same people. That is the hardest lesson these sites teach, and the most important one. The atrocities were not senseless aberrations, not the acts of an alien past. They were responses to pressures we still recognize, to scarcity, to fear, to the hardening of us against them when the world turns hostile. Deep time offers no comforting distance because the impulses on display are entirely familiar. And here is a final sobering thought. These particular horrors survived precisely because they were extraordinary, violent enough, sudden enough, to bury a whole community at once and preserve it. The countless smaller cruelties, the everyday violence that left no mass grave, vanished without a trace. What we call the prehistory is simply the part of the human story told in bone rather than in ink. And the forensic revolution is still rewriting it, decade by decade, discovery by discovery. Each accidental find is a reminder of how little of our own past we've actually seen. The dead in these pits ask for nothing except to be understood accurately, to be counted, to be remembered as they truly were. And to grant them that is to accept a fuller and harder picture of ourselves. A past that was neither an idol nor a nightmare, but simply relentlessly human. These 10 sites are windows, not verdicts. And whatever still lies buried beneath our feet, unread and waiting, may yet prove stranger and darker than anything we have dug up so far. The only real question is how much of who we are is written there in the ground, still waiting for someone to read it.